organizational design for organizational behavior. When we look at organizational design, we look at it within the context of organizational structure. And the design is the process of selecting and managing how the organization structure and culture are organized to achieve the goals of the organization. So what they're trying to do is, this is from an HR perspective, is to design an organization, a structure, to be able to achieve the goals of the company. And if you look at a structure, that's the formal system of task, power, and reporting relationships. And the organization chart is a diagram that just shows the chain of command and reporting relationships within a company. So we got design, it's how we do it, what are the aspects that need to be managed, the structure, the formal system. Now, the formal system gets things done, but the informal system that's not on the organization chart is also critical. And then the chart is the diagram itself. And some of the characteristics that we have when we look at this is, how is labor divided? Do you have employees that are specialists who do certain things, or are they general? So we got to look at that. Formalization. How much of the organization's rules, procedures, and communication are written down and closely followed? How formal of an organization? And then there's centralization. And that is, what's the degree of power and decision-making authority that are concentrated? So where is the decision made? Is it made closest to the customer, or is it made by a very few people at the top? So these are the characteristics. How are we going to divide the labor up? Formalization, centralization. There are so many different ways of doing that. The other thing is, continuing on with the characteristics of organizational structure, hierarchy. That's, is there formal authority over others? Span of control, the number of people reporting directly to an individual. There's probably an effective number, and as we go through some of them, we'll see how that does turn out. Now, here is one where you have a fairly narrow span of control. If we look at that in this business, we have the president, and then we have vice presidents. And reporting to the vice presidents are managers, and reporting to the managers are associate. So this is really, when you look at it, as a narrow span of control. Nobody has a lot of people reporting to them. The managers have 3 people, vice president has 2, president has 2. So that's what we define as a narrow span of control. Here's one, when we look at the organizational chart, that is a wider span of control. So the president in this case has 3, but when you look at the triangles, they have 7. So that's a wider span of control. And sometimes it depends on what the work actually. So when you look at how this is, the structure that is, you start out with a rigid bureaucracy. You do this, you do this, you do this. That's model 1, a very mechanical structure. Then the bureaucracy is run by top management. Then you have a bureaucracy with cross-departmental meetings, teams, and task forces. Then you have a matrix organization. We're seeing this has become, I'd say the first 3, there's very few that run that way. There may be individual parts of the company that run that way, but matrix is how things are worked. Model 5 are project or team-based organizations. That people come together to work on a project or an outcome. And then Model 6 is just loosely coupled people together to do things. So we have these different levels, different models that we look at. So what are some of the things that we look at? What enforces them? What's the business strategy? This comes back to, what are the goals of the company? What is the environment in which they do business? What's the organizational size? There's different needs. Size of company dictates an organizational chart. What is the behavior? What are the expectations of people and workers? What's the technology that is in place? What about organizational change? We did take a look at that earlier on, but that all of these things come together influencing the structure. The business structure, let's take a couple of examples, is being a low-cost producer would require a more hierarchical, rigid structure than would be pursuing an individual strategy, because you're trying to focus in on that cost, doing something at the lowest possible cost. If you're a rapidly changing environment, it needs to be more flexible than a stable environment. But I think we're seeing today that the external environment is changing so rapidly. Nature of the organization's talent, professional skills need to work together on team base. Flatter structure would be more appropriate than taller, bureaucratic structure. Every organization needs structure, but it can still work cooperatively. Larger organizations tend to have greater specialty, greater hierarchy, and more rules. Because in a smaller firm, you're going to have the CFO is going to probably handle human resources, technology, buildings and grounds, so it's going to handle a lot of different things. But in larger organizations, you need people devoted to that. And that is organizations evolve. Expectations. Remember the red bead. If employees are expected to follow rigid rules and procedures, a more hierarchical central structure be called for. But we got to look at that within theory X and theory Y, where the belief is that people either want to work or they don't want to work, and you got to push them. Technology, organizational change, structure needs to change. A lot of companies have a structure built at a point in time to serve a certain need, and the organization changes, and sometimes the organizational structure. So let's look at the different types of organizational structures. Let's bring them all up so that you can see them. The first is a functional structure. That's where you put people together with the same skills or use similar tools or work process. They're put together in departments, the function of what they do. Okay? The divisional structure, a collection of functions organized around a geographic area, product, service, or market. And then there is a matrix structure where employees report both to a project manager and a product team, and to a functional manager. So a functional manager, let me use an example, is that when I was in finance, we had everybody that engaged in any financial function was in the finance organization. We had different roles. We had a general accounting, we had a corporate accounting, we had management accounting, management reporting. So we had similar skills. We see that HR, technology, facilities, manufacturing, sales, where you group people together. Very common. Next is a divisional structure. And I had that. We're going to actually look at my org chart that I had a couple of years ago when I was working at the bank. And that's where I had a geographic area. And then I had all the functions within that. And then a matrix where that you have teams, and I've been part of this too, where you have teams, they sort of report to me, and I probably have the decision on their success or failure, but they're part of another function. Okay? So as much as security was important to my organization in banking, and we had a strong dotted line, they didn't directly report to me, but they matrixly reported to me in the head of corporate security. So we see them going on, and it's this becomes important for you to understand how companies are run to help you define what your career path may or may not be. Continuing on like that, we have team-based structures, horizontal or vertical teams, lattice structure, and this is I like this one. I think this is one of the best that I've seen, is where you have an organization and you come together to work on a specific project or tasks. Okay, right now at the college we have a group of people from multiple disciplines who are working on online learning, Another group is working on intercession. How do we deliver online training better, classes better? And that's sort of the lattice. We've just all come together as a sub-team to see what we can do. And this comes back to the corporation's hierarchy of authority, which we previously talked about. Is you start out with the state charter. Remember, corporation is a legal entity, a person. You start with the state charter. Then there are shareholders, board of directors, management employees. So this defines, in this hierarchy, this is a organizational chart, but it doesn't get into a lot of the details. It just shows you state charter, shareholders, board, manager, employees. Remember, the board of directors' most important thing is to hire and fire management. On a very simple corporate structure, and this is what you see in a lot of businesses, it can be expanded. You have the president, CEO, chief financial officer, who's become more and more important in every corporation. Then we always have somebody that's sales or customer care. And then we have operations or manufacturing. And then administrative support. Administrative support being HR, technology, buildings. For those of you that have worked in a restaurant, the sales customer care is the front of house. Operations manufacturing is the back of house. Okay? So if you think about it from that, and many of you have worked in restaurants, you can see there's this customer facing, and this is the making of it. Here's an organization that is, and they're not always easy to read. And this starts out here, the first line, the guy at the top is the CEO. But who does he have reporting to him? He has a chief operating officer. Then he has a chief financial officer. Then he has different people, communications director he has two. Then he has development. So if you think of what they're doing, it's the operational person. This is the person who makes the organization run. They do training and quality assurance, serving other agencies, facilities and safety, nutrition, operations, warehouse and transportation, and food services. So if you think of a food bank, they got to make sure that all the food is safe. Then food banks distribute food to agencies. And you need someone to liaise with the agency because you may have food, but you need to get it to the pantries and soup kitchens that distribute it. So you need somebody to liaise with them. Then, if you have a food bank, you need a place to store all of this stuff. And then how do you get it to the agencies that distribute it? How do you make sure things are healthy? Food services. So in this organization, the chief operating officers, when we're looking at the raw numbers of people, has the majority. Okay? But that's operations. Then we have the CFO, who's got accounting and IT. Then we see the two communication directors, they must have a need. And then there's a development officer, because nonprofits are, a food bank is a nonprofit, so they need to raise money. So they've broken it down to a capital campaign, a director of development, individual and plan giving, volunteer services, corporate partners, and food resources. So these are probably much smaller staffs, but with a narrower purpose. They all come together to form the organization, and neither can survive without the other. Here's a look at Chipotle, and what you can see here is there's the directors, and what they have a CEO, okay, and when they got here's the directors, there's 7 directors, they got a CEO, a chief executive, co-chief executive officer, Steve Ellis, one of the founders, chairman, co-chief, chief financial officer, chief creative and development officer. Now these don't go much lower, but what we do see is under Mr. Moran is that there's a break off of China. So they have a China manager and then regional managers here in the U.S. The regional managers have the restaurateur, then you have the general manager, then you have the apprentice or internship under general manager, then you have the service manager, and then you have the kitchen manager, and then you have the crew, cashier, and employees. So you think this is how each restaurant is run. The restaurants roll up to a region who roll up to the CEO. And here's one, again, the same thing in China, but China is a separate market. So that's Chipotle. Here's one, I don't remember what kind of organization it is, but again, what you have, a hotel. This is Hilton Hotels. So you got a president, you got hotel general managers who have controllers, hotel human resources, front end, IT, directors of sales. But you see they have a direct line here. This gray line is solid, but there's these dotted lines. Is that the hotel information technology, if we follow the red back, has a dotted line to corporate. And when we look here, the hotel controllers have a dotted line that come into the corporate controller, who reports to the vice president of finance. We then have the directors of sales. We work that all the way up, revenue management, and then to revenue management. That's an analyst. That's the manager. So you have all of these functions. This is truly a matrix organization. That if the hotel general manager doesn't like what the controller is doing, he's probably going to go to the corporate controller. So we have all of these dotted lines. And this is the more informal. These are oftentimes harder to work because it's like having two bosses, and hopefully the goals align with two bosses, but at times they may not. Here's Alphabet, formerly known as Google, and they've broken their business down into the companies. So they don't necessarily have an org chart for the total company, but they have these various projects and or businesses that they have. So they're looking at it is, here you go, and they got Google, our traditional products, secret, here's the projects they're working on, Google Ventures, their venture capital arm, a capital, equity fund, self-driving cars, urban innovation, research, healthcare, all these different areas, because they feel that they can better manage it if you have the businesses. Here is my last organizational chart that I had. I'm Senior Vice President, District Executive for Rochester. I reported to an Executive Vice President who was responsible for retail banking. And on mine, I had, if you start from the far side, I had 6 small business relationship managers. I had a facilities department, security, operations, branch managers, wealth management executive, and they had 12 financial advisors. So while each of these branch managers had a team, and we could break this down and go further, I had a pretty big span of control. So when you look at that, just look across the top, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, plus 22, I had 32 direct reports. At one time, I actually had 60, but that's a little too much. So that's how we ran. Again, a matrix organization. Here's another one. If you ever wonder how government runs, it is even more confusing because they call them offices. So the Secretary of Labor has this piece going in here, they come down here, and you're not quite sure who's responsible for what, but you can see there's a lot of people involved here. And that's complicated. When we look at finance, I just happen to know a little bit more about finance, but just to give you a sense of how it drives down, you have the CFO, then you have the controller who does general accounting, reporting, tax, management accounting. You have the treasurer who does cash management, financing, investor relations. Then you have a compliance function and a risk management. So it does work its way down, and this is just an example of keep pushing it down. For those of you that have taken Finance 311, you've seen this before. But these are the different functions, so it actually breaks down to fair detail. you can take a look at that. Here's another one where, again, you have an advisory board, and you have directors, deputies, chief science, diversifying supply. So they've broken it down functionally also within the Critical Materials Institute. This is an example of an organizational chart with a matrix structure. Is that if you're looking at a team, you have a team leader, and all of these disciplines are on the team. Oftentimes teams are put together to solve problems, because a lot of problems in an organization are it's not simple. When you have when we come back to this, there's processes how things are done within each one of these. So if some of the stuff that we're doing in our branches impacted operations, they need to be part of the team. So when we had things that weren't working, we generally put teams together to try to solve that problem. When I was in finance, we did the same thing. We had a system breakdown at one point. So we had business, technology, finance, and risk management working on a problem, because we all brought different functions and skills to that. This is an interesting one, is a network organization, which is just autonomous units or firms that they act together. Social mechanism for coordination, control, joint ventures. It's an interesting type of organization. And then there is the virtual organization. This is interesting again, and I think it's evolving even more so today and will continue. And the organization contracts out all its functions, except for the name and managing the coordination. They use virtual teams linked by technology. Employees may still meet, but face-to-face. They tend to be a little more complex, but they can exist without having a physical presence. Okay? And then you have communities of practice. In these, again, groups of people who shared experience and expertise in a joint enterprise binds them together. So I guess where I was talking about the online learning community, that's those of us that have an interest in online learning. And managers can enable this. I think it can be really good of putting together, because it sort of puts responsibility back to the worker. But it starts with a clear area of business need. You start small. You bring more people in. Use technology that supports the community's needs. Respect and build on this. Celebrate contributions and build on small successes. So communities of practice. You're going to see an awful lot of that in the coming future as we come together.